Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this seminar, which is obviously incredibly important. Let me start by acknowledging that we are here today on Gadigal land, so we'd like to acknowledge the elders of the Eora Nation and the leaders amongst us as well, and acknowledge that we're all on Aboriginal land, wherever we are on this wonderful new technology that we get to use. So I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present, and the leaders amongst us. Let me also take the opportunity to acknowledge some of the guests that we have here. We have Abigail Boyd, who's a member of the Legislative Council, joining us today. Helen O'Loughlin, who's the Social Commissioner for Greater Sydney Commission. Patricia McKay, the Deputy Public Advocate, ACT Human Rights Commission. And I also want to acknowledge our friends and colleagues in the sector from both government and non-government sector who are joining us, and the young people who are joining us today as well, and the teachers who are here. This is an incredible piece of work that the team has undertaken here, and I want to acknowledge the team at ACYP that you will hear from today, Rhys, who drove this great piece of work. And something that I want to say for all of us is that even though there might be work that we undertake that can be challenging, that can be something that we haven't done before, it's something that we should get comfortable with, and that we should always be striving to ensure that we are representing children and young people across New South Wales who all have a right to be heard and their voice to be heard. So you won't hear a lot from me today, which is a good thing. You'll hear from a lot of experts, and I want to thank the people who are speaking today. I want to acknowledge Julie Charlton, who is a member of our Youth Advisory Council, who will be speaking today, and we're very thrilled to have Julie here. And then I get to very kindly now pass the reins over to Kate Bishop. So thank you, Kate.
Thank you very much, Zoe, and what a lovely welcome for everybody. I would like to join with Zoe in welcoming you all to this morning's session. I think we're actually due to have about 400 people on the call this morning, which is definitely one of the upsides, the positive outcomes of the difficult times we're living at the moment. I'm Dr. Kate Bishop, and I'm the convener of the UNSW Children and Youth Research Network. And together with ACYP, we host the Young Thinking series, and I want to thank Melissa Goldman and the team at ACYP for all the work they're doing behind the scenes to make this series a success at all times. Together, we identify some of the contemporary challenges that children and young people are facing, and we're all dealing with in our different sectors, and we use these as the basis for topics for this series. And we select speakers from research, from government, from industry or practice, and from the community to address these topics. Now, today's topic, as you're aware, is called Challenging Issues in Education for Young People with Disabilities. And we are lucky to have 6 speakers today, which include Rhys Morris and Julie Charlton from ACYP, Professor Eva Strnadová from UNSW and Dr. Joanne Danker from UNSW, Cecile Sullivan Elder, CEO from Family Advocacy, and finally, the Honourable Gareth Ward MP. So, today's format, I will introduce each speaker. They will then speak for 15 minutes, and then Melissa will moderate a Q&A session for the next 5 minutes. As participants, we would like you, please, to make sure at all times that your mic and your video is off. Now, I think ACYP is going to try and manage this centrally, but just in case, you need to be aware that both those icons at the bottom of your screen should be red at all times. And finally, if you'd like to ask a question of the speakers, please use the chat function that's part of this platform, also one of the icons at the bottom of your screen. And Melissa will select the questions from that section to pose to the speakers who'll get a chance to address them. So to kick this off, the first team of speakers includes Rhys Morris and Julie Charlton. Rhys Morris is a Senior Participation Advisor at ACYP and has recently undertaken consultations with more than 350 children and young people with disability across New South Wales. He will be presenting the findings from these consultations today, together with Julie Charlton, a member of the New South Wales Youth Advisory Council and a young person with lived experience of disability. Thank you, Rhys and Julie.
Thank you, Kate and Zoe, and good morning, everybody. So my name is Rhys, and I'm part of the participation team here at ACYP. So today I'm going to give you a quick overview of the work of the office, and in particular, some of the key findings and learnings from our recent consultations with children and young people with disability. So this report will be launched in August, but this is a wonderful opportunity for us to share some of our findings and learnings here today. Next slide. Okay, so for those of you who don't know about the role of the office, who we are and what we do. So we're an independent office that reports directly to Parliament. We're a child rights-based organisation, and we advocate and promote the well-being of children and young people aged 0 to 24 in New South Wales. So that's 2.4 million children and young people. Like I said, I'm part of the participation team, and a big part of our work is to promote participation of children and young people in the decisions that affect them. So we seek their views, ideas, opinions on all issues affecting them. From this feedback, then, we make recommendations to government and non-government agencies on a whole range of things like legislation, reports, policies, practices and services affecting children and young people. We also have an amazing policy team who conduct research into issues affecting children and young people. And lastly, we're currently in the process of developing our next 3-year strategic plan. So since the office came into fruition in 2015, we've consulted with 32,000 children and young people, 12,000 of which have been through face-to-face consultations. As part of our office mandate, we give priority to the interests and needs of vulnerable children and young people, which includes children and young people with disabilities. As a team, we use a variety of participation methods in our work, which includes structured interviewing, focus groups, online polling and surveys, as well as creative interactions and peer-led focus groups. ACYP always includes children and young people with disability in all the work that we do, but this project has been the first time we've specifically sought to speak to children and young people with disabilities as an exclusive group. Okay, so some of our reports. So we've produced many reports as an office. Many reports as an office from a range of topics, settings and groups of children and young people. Some of the reports that I've highlighted in the slide are some of the many reports we've done, but in particular, the reason that I've pulled these out as they include many children and young people with disabilities. And all these are all available on our website should you want to learn and read a little bit more about these reports. So the aim of this consultation in particular was to further facilitate the voices of children and young people with disability. This again fits into the principles of participation in the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child, the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disability, and our own legislative mandate. So we hope from the feedback from children and young people and the sharing of their experiences, it inspires other organisations and agencies to value the work and the experiences to inform and improve not only disability-specific services for children and young people, but all programmes, projects and services for children and young people. So the purpose of the report is to reflect all the views and opinions of children and young people as they were expressed to ACYP. It is not to say that government and non-government organisations do not undertake significant work in this area, but more to report the things that are important for children and young people from their lived experiences and the truth according to them. And we hope it can be used as an useful tool to guide and prioritise some of your work. So before I go any further, I'd like to introduce Julie Charlton from the Youth Advisory Council.
Thank you, Rhys. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Julie Charlton. I'm 21 years old and I am an Australian elite para-athlete and a disability advocate. A little bit about me. I've been working in the disability field since I was 7. My first role was as Northcote Disability Services Spina Bifida Awareness Week Ambassador. My other roles throughout my career have included 2 times Don't Diss My Ability Awareness Ambassador, Wheelchair Sports New South Wales Volunteer, Children and Young People with a Disability Conference Advisory Council member, and many other areas that are to do with my sporting adventures. Most recently, I have been a member for the last 16 months as a member of the ACYP 2019 Youth Advisory Council. All of these opportunities have allowed me to use my voice in order to make a change for my community and for children and young people in New South Wales. Through the creation of this report, ACYP have given children and young people with a disability the same opportunity to use their voices to speak on things that affect their lives every day. The topic of education, it was because of the inclusionary efforts of my high school PE teacher as to why I am an Australian representative in track and field. It is because of my love of social studies and early junior education at an international school, which gave me the motivation to want to pursue further work in advocacy. But there were hiccups along the way, whether it was a lack or an unwillingness to understand my disability or how it affects my education, or for the need for reform within the education sector. These setbacks told me and taught me how to use my voice to make a change and how to uphold my rights. Thank you to the advocate and to the team here at ACYP for giving me this opportunity, and thank you all for listening.
Excellent, thank you, Julie. So the consultations themselves, what did we do? So we met with 372 children and young people in 45 different groups over a 5-month period. In terms of demographics, 69% of those were male, 30% female. Again, in regards to a mix of age ranges, we worked with children and young people ages young as 8 all the way through to 24. And as you can see, there's quite a diverse mix of ages included in these consultations. And a bit of a breakdown in terms of some of the Aboriginal children and young people who participated, as well as the called. Here's some of the locations and settings we travelled to. So we travelled across as many locations as possible and in as many settings. And this was really to try and have a really diverse representation of all children and young people across the state. Here's a quick list of the different disabilities. This is not an actual description of these terms, but a very simplistic explanation of some of the disabilities and needs of the children and young people that were involved in these consultations. So what did we ask? The questions. So we asked 3 questions, which were, what is working well for you and other children and young people in New South Wales? What is not working well for you and other children and young people in New South Wales? And the 3rd question, what would you like to change to make New South Wales a better place for children and young people? So these open-ended questions are to encourage the sharing of information, opinions and experiences, as well as to initiate group discussions. Sometimes we had to adapt the language in terms of making sure that we included everybody and in terms of their communication needs and levels. So before I go any further to tell you about what the children and young people said, here is a quick video of their feedback and their experiences.
Just great support at a young age really makes a difference in later life.
I feel like I wasn't disabled because I got able to be the same as another person.
Good support. The support workers help us very well.
I was able to go to a normal school, which was able to give me that other side of the world.
School. Got teachers.
Like classwork, helping us with, helping us get out of trouble.
Learn and play with friends.
What I found to be really good is the use of facilities such as Headspace.
Sport and making new friends and exploring new things.
The program that we're doing is good because it gives us a chance to socialise with other people that have a disability.
Kids have the opportunity, when they're over 18, they can go to Auslan classes. So that's good that they can then communicate with signing.
We're also lucky here because we have like accessible like ramps, stuff like out in the community.
School sort of system in general doesn't cater well towards students with disabilities. It's just sort of a one-size-fits-all solution.
Some people don't even believe me, or they kind of forget that it's there.
There's not enough basic communication skills being taught at schools, my age or like anyone else's age, that they have trouble probably asking.
In high school, we never got a chance to do the HCC.
Not enough interest clubs in school.
I don't like getting bullied.
We need to have more teachers here.
With communication, like in general, people can't communicate with deaf people because there's a communication breakdown if they can't sign.
A lot of people around my age, or even like 10, 20 years older than me, suffer from like severe depression.
Employers being reluctant to hire people with disabilities.
Being discriminated when going to interviews.
Discrimination.
Social media, cyberbullying.
I don't know how that.
When I go to the shopping mall, I have no access.
Kids like bully you because you're disabled or in another unit for no reason, and I'm kind of really sick of it.
Give people with disabilities more of a chance, like as much of a chance as they do than people without disabilities when they're going for a job.
If maybe employers can be like educated on people with disabilities.
More talk and more awareness around disabilities.
Make it easier for the youth in this town to get some jobs.
Showing young teens the support system earlier rather than later.
So to have new Auslan classes for hearing people, to improve the signing so the communication is improved, be much easier to communicate with deaf people. Yeah.
New body tunes.
We should donate more money for bushfires.
There could be more charities.
To incorporate more training for government-led organisations and departments such as the Department of Education, specifically around teachers and dealing with children in crisis.
Okay, great. So moving on swiftly from the consultations, I'm conscious we're running out of time. So there were 6 key themes identified, which were determined by the frequency of this, when the topics were raised. So out of those 6, the one I'm going to focus on today is education, given the topic of the seminar. So just to touch on these quite quickly, some of the things that children spoke about, both that were working well and not working well. So some of these were school teachers in an environment that was dedicated to addressing challenges associated with learning with a disability, that offered personal care and one-to-one support. In particular, a lot of children and young people spoke about having teachers and support staff that would go over and above to help them both in the classroom and outside of the classroom. For many young people, the opportunities they have within mainstream schools and support units within mainstream schools offered them the opportunity to access every possible activity and to be included in all aspects of school life. Learning life skills was something that came up in most of our consultations. In particular, children and young people spoke about community access and learning about real world life skills, things that would help them with their independence. Work experience, the opportunity to learn skills that would help them in their future to get employment and give them an enormous sense of value, purpose, and empower them in the future. And again, for a lot of people, access to extracurricular activities. Not working well. Some students felt their education had been negatively impacted by discrimination and their school's inclusivity and adaptability to their special needs. One powerful quote that has resonated with me is from a young female who said, "They didn't understand me, so they ignored me." Students spoke about their needs not being met in schools, and they needed to be better to support people with disabilities. And that included learning in the classroom and outside of the classroom. About voice, people spoke about just being asked simple questions and not kind of directing it to parents or carers about decisions that affect their lives. And last of all, just about general facilities in schools and amenities. Just quickly to touch on, because we're running out of time rapidly, just quickly to touch on some of the recommendations, and these are from children and young people themselves. So increase in resourcing, that means support staff, teachers, equipment and facilities. Education awareness, that came up in all the consultations around having education from a young age. Having buildings to provide equipment for physical disability should be considered essential, and always having the opportunity to have a voice in the decision making and being able to adapt and change practice for that to happen. I'm just conscious of time and we have to move on. Again, the report will be launched in full in August. So I hope that's given you a bit of an insight into some of the further discussions around some of the topics and some of the themes. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to share some of these with you today. And I look forward to chatting with you more about some of the further findings and learnings. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rhys and Julie. That was really fantastic. We've got one question from Louise asking if the data are available to share with staff in schools.
Yes, the report itself is going to be made public. Within that report, there's data being collected on a whole range of topics, not only the 3 questions, but in terms of the themes and how often they were talked about, and verbatim responses from the children and young people themselves. So when the report is made public, sometime in August, we'll be sure to send it on to you.
We've also got a comment from Craig that the video sparked a thought that Auslan should be offered as a language at school for all students, which would be far more useful than current offers. Julie, do you want to say anything about that?
I would 100% agree with that. I would love to see Auslan as a subject in schools so that I would be able to have conversations with, people within my community who can't have that same opportunity usually.
Great, thank you again, guys. Big virtual clap. And we will now move back to Kate Bishop.
Thank you very much, Mel and Julian Rhys. That's an excellent introduction to what looks like a fantastic piece of work that we all look forward to reading more in full later on this year by the sounds of it. Now I'd like to introduce speaker number 2. That's Professor Eva Strnadová, and she works in the School of Education at the University of New South Wales and is also academic lead research at the UNSW Disability Innovation Institute. She is a passionate advocate for people with disabilities, with a particular focus on people with intellectual disabilities. Today, she will present the findings from an inclusive research study titled Sexuality and Sexual Identity Education for Students with Intellectual Disability and Autism. Thank you very much, Eva.
Thank you very much for introducing me, Kate, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very important event. I would like to talk today about the findings from a study that we have just recently conducted with my colleague Julie Loblings. And this study looked at, as I said, sexuality and sexual identity education for students with intellectual disability or autism. I would like to first start exploring a bit the background to this study, and what really led us to conducting it. The literature, the research literature from the last few decades is not providing a very optimistic picture when it comes to population of students, especially and adults, especially with intellectual disability. We continue to see that they, despite many efforts for social inclusion and educational inclusion, remain to be mostly isolated. They are very often objected to neglect and abuse and bullying. There is a very sad history of forcing women with intellectual disability into sterilization. They also are very often victims of domestic violence. When becoming parents, it is very common that their children are removed from their care, and very often without any reason, such as proof of neglect or neglect of care or abuse of their children, but just simply because of the label of their disability. And they tend to be underestimated by others when it comes to their learning, their ability to learn new things, etc., etc. So there is unfortunately, as a result, very limited education achieved by the students, and as a result, very high rate of unemployment, and many people with intellectual disability living in poverty. When it comes to a population of students with not just students, but girls and women with intellectual disability, there is a really very daunting statistics around domestic violence and other forms of gender-based violence, such as rape and reproductive rights violations. The literature talks about 4 times more likelihood of experiencing domestic violence, sometimes during their lives. Also, in terms of sexual abuse, the literature brings anywhere between 60 to 90% of girls and women with intellectual disability being sexually abused sometimes during their lives. The quote that I have here about the domestic violence, that is from one of my studies, and that was an experience of one of the mothers with intellectual disability that I interviewed. They also tend to have decisions made for themselves rather than being supported in making their own decisions. And thus their self-determination and self-advocacy is quite limited, not because of the nature of their disability, but rather how we tend to disable them. When we look at the sexuality education, and again what we know from literature, despite from this population having the same rights to quality sexuality education, they tend to receive less sexual education, the typically developing peers, and there are also deficiencies in their sexuality education, meaning that some topics would be simply avoided. That means, of course, leave them unprepared for their future lives and current lives as well. And it's not just in terms of identifying sexual abuse or neglect, but of course also their relationships, parenting, other aspects of life. So, based on all this knowledge, also based on research studies that I have conducted in the past, and some of them have been conducted inclusively. That means that I have been in a research team where there is with intellectual disability. Some of those were conducted with Rhys Lobbins, who is on the photo here, who is herself passionate self-advocate. She is a mother of 3 children. She herself has intellectual disability. She also became this year a adjunct lecturer at UNSW, which I'm very proud of. So based on our studies from the past, when we talked with parents with intellectual disabilities, and they tend to talk to us about their experiences of domestic violence, their experiences of sexual abuse, and also about lack of sexuality education in their school. These parents were aged anywhere between 20 and 50 plus years. So we were really interested whether the sexuality education is looking any better for our students at the present times. That's why we interviewed students with intellectual disability, their parents and their teachers. And we were really interested mainly about their experiences with the content and also delivery of the sexuality education. I will talk mostly about what the actual students told us, but I really feel that I should mention a few points also made by teachers, which are really important. Firstly, it's really sad that the majority of teachers, though not surprising, have experience with their students with intellectual disability and or autism being sexually abused. And very often this was disclosed to them by almost an accident when student described some disturbing behavior by relative or family friend most of the time, and did not even realize that what was happening was actually against the law. They also talked about incidents of domestic violence in families of children with intellectual disabilities. They also talked about the fact that the sexuality related topics and sexuality education does not tend to be that often included in the individual educational plan meetings, and that is really concerning, given that we are looking at the consultative planning process when and consultative approach to curriculum. And just on my piece very quickly, because I know this is not the focus of this talk, but only 3 teachers said out of the teachers we talked to that students with intellectual disability were actually present in developing the IEP plans, and none of the students actually ever received a copy of their own educational plan. So I think that is something to look into as well. Nevertheless, moving on, here are some of the key topics that the students shared with us in the interviews. They talked about topics that they would love to learn about sexuality education, however, are explored by their teachers. One of them was planning pregnancy. They did say that teachers talk about, how does it look like when somebody is pregnant, but they don't really talk about how to think about planning the pregnancy, consider whether they they would want to plan children or not, etc. So that was something they wanted to hear about more. They also would love to hear more about online dating. Now, given that we all now live, and especially during the COVID, but even without it, we live online so much, it is understandable that young people meet each other online as well. Yet the students said that the teachers used with them mostly the of really careful. There mostly are predators out there, and of course it's understandable in terms of vulnerability of this population. But really, they were calling for more proactive strategies, how to do the online exploration and meeting other people more safely. They also wanted to learn more about masturbation, and that was something that was also brought by the teachers. One really big topic was actually learning about sexual and gender identities. And in this sense, the students did talk about the fact that the teachers would mostly talk about heterosexual identities, not really acknowledging and recognizes that there are so many other identities. This was also highlighted by some of the parents, talking about their battles with the school to even at least acknowledge that people might be, for example, homosexual. So this was experience that I put here of one of the students who talked to us, who herself found out that she is asexual and also gender fluid. This was something that really took her a long time to arrive to, and only learn so by talking with her parents, where they had a very nice trust-based relationship, to whom she was describing their parents, and thanks to them she arrived at this. But she would have really felt much better if she would hear at school that it's okay, not everybody has to be heterosexual and so on. The students also talked about that they would want to learn more about what is domestic violence, and most of them would say that they've learned about what this term means really more from TV or from parents, but not at school. And it was interesting because one of the teachers we talked to commented when she talked about the context of sexuality education and what she talks about with students with intellectual disability, that she does not want to explore domestic violence because it could be too disturbing for them. And yet alone, as I said in the beginning, the statistics are really awful for this population. They are much more likely to actually be in a situation of domestic violence, not always recognizing that it is such thing. So it is really prudent to explore these topics as well. The students also talked about teaching methods and approaches they would prefer, and this was really just a masterclass, I think, for teachers if they would listen to the students. And I love the quote that I'm using on this slide, when one of the students says, "I want to know, but I don't understand the way you are teaching." And I think that was a very powerful one. The students were calling for teachers using plain or easy English resources, and to give credit to teachers, they really were trying to find these resources, but they were talking about lack of these resources and their availability. Now, there are of course some that have been developed, such as New South Wales planning, family planning, which they do a wonderful job in this area. SECA has developed great resources as well. So there are the pockets of where we can find resources, but they are not public knowledge. They are not even general knowledge for the teachers. So this is something we need to improve. The students also called for using more videos and pictures because they learn better visually. They were asking for repetition and highlighting that if they talk about specific topics only once and these are not revisited, then in the following years they just forget and they don't learn. They also talked about how teachers use many complicated terms or new terms that they don't explain, and that of course very much limits their learning. And so kind of use here a few quotes from the students. Also, they really said that they would like teachers to check whether they understand. So again, some of the very good evidence-based practices that teachers should be using. Last but not the least, students also talked about the importance of the teacher and student relationship. And here they really talked about how difficult it is when the teachers keep on changing from year to year, being the PDHB teachers or teachers who are teaching this subject, because it's just really hard to develop that relationship of trust to talk about these topics, or even wanting to ask the questions when it's somebody they don't know. So there are quite a few implications for improving teachers' education and really their continuous education, not just the pre-service education. And some of them are really highlighting to teachers and the future teachers importance of not making assumptions. And sometimes, we all might have some stereotypical beliefs, such as of course, not true, but a belief that a person with intellectual disability can't have a child, but that should never dictate my belief as a professional to then limit topics such as planning for pregnancy, eliminating such topics from the sexuality education. It's also really important to just incorporate lifespan perspectives into teachers' training. It is really important that the teachers always have that lifespan idea about what's ahead of the students that they are teaching, and what future they want to prepare them for, but also what are some of the maybe not very good statistics that are facing this population, and which then the sexuality education can prevent, the quality sexuality education can prevent. And really we need to explore much more accessible approaches to providing the information in sexuality education and of course beyond. Thank you for your listening, and I'm ready for any questions.
Thanks, Eva, for that. We have a couple of questions. We have one from Kath. She's asking if any of your research was completed with students and teachers in rural and remote New South Wales.
And it wasn't, and it is definitely my next plan. This one was conducted in regional and metropolitan New South Wales schools.
Thanks, Eva. And then we have from Kate, what are the immediate recommendations for change, and how do you think the sectors need to work together to bring them about?
Oh, there are so many recommendations. So I think we definitely need to improve teacher awareness. I think that all the teachers are aware of the urgency of some of the topics that they need to be teaching the students about. I definitely think that we need to have a centralized place, and be just for sexuality education, of plain or easy English resources that the teacher could approach and use their teaching. And also talking about the importance of being explicit. And I know this because we also provide professional learning in the school where I work at UNSW for teachers who teach these topics to students with intellectual disability and autism. And it's really interesting because I show them the resources, the easy resources. There is a lot of pictorial and very explicit, because this is what you really need for this population of students. And some of the teachers would tell me, "Oh, but I wouldn't feel comfortable using this. It's too explicit." But well, if you don't use it, how are things meant to? So I think also this is really something very important. In terms of sectors working together, that's a brilliant question on its own. There are different programs that have been developed in terms of sexuality education, or even just beyond sexuality education, relationships education. For example, ITRS, Intellectual Disability Rights Service, developed a fantastic rights and relationship program that was piloted with people with intellectual disability. Power in it is that it's also co-delivered by intellectual disability, and we are in the process of working together as a university, IDRS, Advocacy Sydney, and Martrebel High School in piloting this program with high school students. So I think there are some really great possibilities that we need to explore.
Thank you. And Finn has asked if you're aware of any programs that raise awareness for teachers around disability and how to better teach those who have disabilities.
Look, the awareness about disability, that should be really and is part of the teacher's education. And there is luckily mandatory unit on special/inclusive education. The targets are different, but it's about teaching students with disabilities in mainstream schools, and that is one place to begin with. Is it enough? No, definitely not. And we need more of these.
And then just one final question. Do you think we need to get better at involving young people with disabilities in their own education?
Oh, absolutely. And just listening to I used the quotes that you saw. Listen to the student. I was just hoping, I was just thinking that I could have now all teachers with me listening to them as well when they were sharing their experiences. I also think that we need to make much better use in inviting people with experience of disability into teachers programs. So, I always invite people into my teacher education classes that I teach, because I think that is the biggest thing, when the teachers can talk and listen to somebody who they maybe would not have high expectations of achieving in the future, wrongly, of course, but we all have some stereotypes, I guess. And it's beautiful to see how suddenly their perception change, and they are so much more open-minded, and they can see the potential of their students that they maybe couldn't see before.
Thank you so much, Eva. I will now hand back over to Kate to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you very much, Mel. And thank you very much, Eva, for generously sharing your wonderful work. I, as the convener of the network at UNSW, have this wonderful collection of about 80 academics who are working in the area of children and youth in their research, and they very generously give their time to all my taps on the shoulders when I say, please, can you come and support this, this and this. It's wonderful to have such a team to draw on at all times. Now, can I just remind you all, please, to turn your videos off and your mics off at all times. There are a few on, I can see. Okay, so next speaker. Let me introduce Dr. Joanne Danker, who works in the School of Education at the University of New South Wales. Prior to her work at UNSW, Joanne was a mainstream primary school teacher and has taught students with various disabilities. Her research interests include the well-being of students with developmental disabilities and participatory research approaches. The title of her presentation today is Listening to the Voices of Students with Autism on Their Well-being in School. Thank you very much, Joanne.
Thank you, Kate, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for having me. So today I'll be sharing with you the findings of my research on the well-being of students with autism. So what got me to look into the well-being of students with autism is that that's really a lot of literature out there, student well-being, but really at that time when I was doing the research, there was really very little or maybe none specifically on students with autism. And we do know that students with autism, they experience school differently. So it's possible that their well-being could also be different. And so these were my research objectives. I wanted to find out how they conceptualize well-being, what are some of the barriers, and some assets that we can draw upon to help enhance their well-being. And these were my research questions. I'll let you have a look for a while. So you will notice that I actually focus on teachers, parents, and students' perspectives, but for today, I'll just be sharing with you the perspectives on students. The breakdown of my participants, they were from 7 mainstream high school in Sydney, more males than females. So how I collected the data from my students was that I got them to do this project called Photo Voice Project. So what it does is just simply that, giving students a voice through the photographs that they have taken. And so I got them to take photographs of things that are related to their well-being. And this is a really good research tool. It's that you could also use in school if you want to find out about just any issues related to their lives, because it actually gives students a voice. Students with autism, they might not be good at, not all of them, but maybe if you have students who might not be good at writing or reading, all they need to do is really just to take the photographs, in which I think most students nowadays are pretty good at, and just later on to share some of their thoughts on the photographs that they have taken. And they really like sharing the photographs. They were all very engaged in the process. So these were the guiding questions. I got them to take photographs on what does having a good life in school mean to me, what prevents them from having a good life in school, and what helps them to have a good life in school. So these were tied to my research questions. And I used the term good life because it's really, it's broad. It's not as abstract as student well-being. It's easy to understand, and they could come up with any meaning of what a good life in school means to them. So these were the findings. This was how they conceptualized student well-being. It consists of their emotional well-being, their social well-being, well-becoming, and learning in school. Emotional well-being. A lot of the students talk about the importance of just feeling positive emotions, like having fun, being happy. This was a little bit different from the teachers and the parents' perspective. The teachers and the parents were focused more on feelings of safety. One of the students took a photograph of the dog that you see there, and he said he wants to be as happy as the dog because the dog looks like he's having lots of fun. They also spoke of negative emotions. They felt anxious in school. They had mental breakdowns, suicidal thoughts. And one of the issues, I think, one of the main reasons that they were experiencing anxiety is the amount of workload that they were experiencing in school. Suicidal thoughts were mainly because of the bullying that they experienced. They also talked about their social well-being. Again, they took many photographs of their friends, of their teachers. To them, friends were important to them because they were supportive. They just wanted to have a good laugh with their friends. And their teachers were really a source of, again, a support for them. They were safe people that they could go to. And for many of the students that I spoke to, they don't have many friends. So the teachers were their friends to them. However, they also realized that they had issues with social interaction. I'll let you have the quote. I'll read the quote. Okay, so they do want to meet new people, but they don't really know how to keep the conversation going. So one of the ways is simply teach them some of their social skills, how to keep the conversations going explicitly. We could also think the other way. Are there any other strategies where we could use? Maybe we could teach typically developing students on how to communicate with students with autism. So it's not just a one-way approach. The third domain is about well-becoming. So the students were talking about their plans for the future. So their experience of a good life right now, it's not just what's happening in the present. They were already thinking ahead. They were talking about their ambitions, what they want to do after they leave school. And they realized how important the good grades are, because they were measuring, if you don't have good grades, you probably will not get employed in future. So again, discussing, do we have maybe transition goals in place? Do we actually talk to the students about what is it that they want to be in future? Do they have the skills to get there? Are we building up the skills? The fourth domain was learning in school. They spoke of the lessons that they enjoyed, some of the favorite subjects, which were really diverse across the students, and some of the ways in which they learn best, which is not surprising that quite a few of them mentioned having hands-on activities in school, lessons that were fun, that were engaging, where the teacher doesn't just talk at you, but really did a lot of activities with them, and they love experiments. They also spoke of some of the conditions in school that help with their learning. Just being equipped with the proper stationery, having ample working space, just a comfortable classroom, air-conditioned classroom. So what are some of the barriers? We could actually put them into three categories: sensory, social, associated with learning. And again, they are quite tight with how they actually conceptualized well-being. So you've got sensory barriers. Many of the students that I spoke to, they talked about how they couldn't cope with the noise in school. They took photographs of the school bell, of the noisy canteen area, noisy classrooms, and they said that it affected them, affected their concentration. And I'll let you read the quote by Matt. And it also caused them to experience migraines. Again, this is one barrier that's not been picked up in the interviews that I had with parents, and just probably only 2 or 3 of the teachers that I spoke to out of around 20 mentioned noise as a barrier. So we really need to look into this, maybe discuss with your students, because although students with autism might have sensory issues, not all of them will have the same sensory issues. Social barriers, they felt that their peers were very mean and annoying to them. They were being called names. And they're also at that age, adolescents, where their friends, their peers are really important to them. So they want to fit in, but they do know that they're different in some ways. So they don't feel accepted by their peers. And they also spoke of being bullied in school. Many of them were being bullied in school. However, they also had strategies to cope, which was good. Some of the strategies were telling their teachers, telling their parents. Some of them felt that it just wasn't useful to tell their parents or their teachers because nothing gets done anyway. So what they did was just to shrink themselves, try not to get noticed or picked on by their peers. There were also others who were more proactive, where they tried to establish good relationships with their peers so that they will not be picked on. So maybe one thing that schools could do, we all have, schools do have anti-bullying policies, but do we actually explain to the students what are the steps that you can take if you experience bullying? Who can you go to? So make it a very safe, safe environment for the students. barriers associated with learning, the students mentioned that they felt bored in school. Andy said that isn't much to do in high school except for learning. And I think this quote, I think it maybe implies that he doesn't understand how it links to his future. Maybe it's not meaningful for him. So how do we connect? Is it possible to connect what they're learning in school right now to the skills that they will be using in future? They also talked about uninteresting lessons, again, where the teacher talked at them. One of the ways of coping with boredom, and that's taken by the students, was to look at the clock and to count down to when the bell rings at school and they can leave. Homework was also a huge barrier, and that's the picture where the students took off his homework during the holidays. And it caused them a lot of anxiety because they didn't know if they were able to complete the homework on time. They also didn't know which to start first. And they weren't happy that there wasn't a lot of downtime during the school holidays to do whatever they wanted. So one way that we could help students with this, maybe we could teach them time management skills, how to organize their time better, maybe breaking down the task for the students, or even working with the different subject teachers so that their homework doesn't come in all at the same time. To enhance their well-being, the students wanted access to technology. So you can see the picture of the Google Classroom. So it really helped with their learning. They appreciated the fact that they were able to, even if they were not well, they could get onto Google Classroom to keep up with the activities that were being done in school. They could also ask questions, even if they were not at school. They also wanted to have access to laptop, whether it's provided by the school or they bring their own laptop, because it really helps them with typing. They didn't like to write. It was also much faster for them. And besides academic, it's also about interacting with their peers. You can read the quote there from Mark. So what they do is, maybe looking at some videos, looking at some photos, having a laugh about it, sharing, commenting about it. So we can think about maybe allowing students to use their mobile in school, but with boundaries set up for them, explaining to them what are some of the rules regarding using the phone in school. Because after they leave school, they will need to use, I think most of them will use phones. It's quite difficult to live your life without having a phone. And access to favorite places in school. Students took many photographs of the library. That's a quiet place. So somewhere where they can just keep calm so that they will not, there isn't sensory overload. Food was also really important to them. So they wanted to have a variety of food during lunchtime, during recess. But they did mention that the food prices in school was a bit too high. They also spoke of the people who could help enhance their well-being, which was really school community members, different school community members. Teachers, again, was so important. Teachers' aides, and quite a few of them referred to the teachers' aides as teachers. The parents were really important because they provided them with just the basic necessities of life. And their peers were important to them, especially when they felt accepted by their peers. They didn't feel that they were any different just because of their disability. The students spoke of how they could help themselves to have a good life in school, being confident, because being confident would allow them to strike up a conversation with their peers, would allow them to ask for help if they need it. Good communication skills would help with having discussions, and open-mindedness. I'll let you read the quote. That was an explanation of open-mindedness by Matt. So I think what he was really trying to express was just to have a acceptance of himself, of the situation that he is in, of his peers. And so one way that we can teach them to accept themselves maybe is to use positive narratives, especially when it comes to their disabilities. There are quite a few students that I spoke to who who didn't want to have autism. So to conclude, what we can actually do to support the well-being of students with autism is to remove the barriers, the sensory, the social, and those that are associated with learning. And can we also take a strengths-based approach, developing the skills, the qualities that the students have mentioned, and also think about the school community members. Maybe can we have professional learning where we are teaching, where we are educating the school community members on autism awareness. And that's it for me. Thank you, and I'm ready for your questions if there are any.
Thanks very much, Joanne. We've got time for one or two questions. So at the end of your research, do you have recommendations to make for the physical environments of schools and for how teachers can think of the built environment as a tool in their kit?
Yeah, I think we need to think about the sensory barriers. Maybe instead of using, like, the students were mentioning about the school bell. So instead of using school bell, using those with music. And also, can we think about maybe echoey classrooms to put up those, like, can we use like softer, how do I call that? Like maybe put up curtains to make, yeah.
And Annika is asking if you've done any research or have any recommendations for young people in the school setting that are in custody.
School settings that are in custody. And are they related to students with autism?
Annika, do you want to elaborate on your question?
I think because I didn't work with students who were in custody, I don't think I could comment on that.
Yeah, sure. And what are the types of favourite places that students identified in school?
Yeah, there were many. Like I mentioned, library, quiet places. One of the students took photographs of a garden in school that was just for use for students in support units. So typically developing students were not allowed there. So it's somewhere quieter for them. That's also a playground where the was in the student's school, and they like being on the merry-go-round to spin. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Joanne. Annika, perhaps we can take that question offline and respond to you separately. So I'm going to hand back to Kate to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Melissa. It's always excellent to see young researchers and hear of their work in a field. It's a sign of a very healthy discipline, and that's terrific for us all. All right, so my last introduction for the morning is for our fourth speaker for today, and I'm introducing Cecile Sullivan Elder, and she's the Executive Officer at Family Advocacy and has worked as a professional within the disability sector for over 25 years in many roles, from community visitor with the Ombudsman Department, TAFE teaching in disability studies, and change management within the disability service sector. She's extensive experience with self-management of funding for people with disability. Today, she will discuss the current implications occurring for many students with disability across New South Wales in relation to receiving an inclusive education and the way forward from here. Thank you, Cecile.
Yep, wonderful. Thank you, Kate. Now let's hope all of that extends to my ability to be able to use this technology. So I'm just going to go and share the appropriate screen. Wonderful. Can everybody see that screen?
Yes, perfect.
Yep, wonderful. Okay. Look, it's great to be here today, and it's a fantastic opportunity. And I want to thank the Office of the Advocate for Children and Young People to actually hold this event that's looking at the challenging issues in education for young people with disability. In my presentation today for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to be focusing on inclusive education of students with disability, in which there are many significant challenges currently going on today. And I'd like to share some of these along with the history and what the evidence tells us in relation to the necessity of this approach and how the momentum for change is going across Australia and how we can all be involved to be able to support this. Okay, so I'm here on Darug land here in Western Sydney, and I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Darug people, for the traditional owners on this land. And also, we're all over the place. We might even be all over the country. So I'd like to extend our respects to the traditional custodians of the lands that you're all on now, as well as our appreciation for First Nations peoples' continuing connection to land, water, culture and community. I'd also like to pay our respects to elders past and present and emerging and certainly warmly welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people that are joining us here today. As Kate mentioned, I'm the Executive Officer of Family Advocacy. Family Advocacy is a statewide disability advocacy organisation that was founded 29 years ago by family members of people with disabilities in New South Wales. There was a lot of concern then around what was afforded to people with disabilities as far as life options, and also a lot of the things that were going on back then for people with disabilities. The founding families really wanted to think through what's a form of protection, how do we safeguard our family members with disabilities, and how do we include them in the protection and the rights and interests of people with disabilities more broadly. 29 years on, we're still governed by family members with disabilities. We provide statewide advocacy advice and support. We undertake systems advocacy in relation to addressing significant barriers and issues with many systems that impact negatively on people with disabilities in New South Wales. And we're also funded to support the engagement of people with disabilities and families with the work of the Disability Royal Commission. Just quickly, we've also got an initiative within family advocacy that was launched in 2010, Resourcing Inclusive Communities. The vision of this is that people with disabilities thrive in the heart of community, sharing the same opportunities as everyday Australians. And we do this through certainly picking up projects, but providing resources, training, mentoring, and supporting change more broadly with people with disabilities, families, communities and services. And I know we've talked a little bit about work today and employment that was raised, Rhys, in your presentation, but you literally, basically that we've got a project at the moment that's actually focused on the employment outcomes of people with disabilities. Are my slides working on everybody's side?
No, we haven't moved slides, sorry.
Okay, beautiful. All right, are we up to date now?
If we need to be on an initiative of family advocacy launched in 2010.
Beautiful. Okay, fantastic. All right. Right now, okay, so basically, what do we mean by, okay, just let me have a look. So when we're talking about people with disabilities living in the heart of the communities, what are we actually talking about? And this slide clearly illustrates that for many people, the top line is something that we may take for granted. The path in many ways has been set for many of us, and we know that we're likely to go to the neighbourhood school with our neighbourhood friends and so on and so forth. Similarly, if you're a person with disabilities in Australian society, particularly with a certain diagnosis, you're pretty much assured that the bottom pathway is where you will end up. And as you can see, this bottom line continues to take the person with disabilities away from everyday and typical. And in many respects, they are living another lifestyle, you can say, not the same. And certainly with many of these points along the bottom line, keep people with disabilities very much separate from the rest of society and its many opportunities that it presents. Of course, there's no rational reason why this needs to be so. It just is, and that's what we've done. Okay, so when we consider special education, this actually also applies. I want to give you a brief overview of education for people with disabilities because in the grand scheme of things, it's a reasonably recent development. For the vast majority of history, children with disabilities were seen as uneducable and even untrainable. And it was illegal for them to attend school, with most of the kids staying at home with their families or being placed in institutions. Between the 1920s and 1970s, special schools for children with disabilities began to emerge. These schools were entirely parent funded and in some cases even parent built. Parents recognised that their children had capacity to learn. Special schools continued to be established by parents until the early 70s, when government became involved in funding of, regulating and governance of these schools. From here, the system of segregation and congregated schooling for people with disability evolved. This is a really interesting point to consider because the continuation of the segregated system wasn't done on any evidence base. It was just a continuum of an already established system that was only created in the first place because there was no other option. As this system has evolved, the community came to assume that children with disability need to be in separate places in which to be educated, and the underlying assumption here is that it's the best educational option. Of course, over the years, this has been strongly reinforced with the institutionalisation of people with disabilities more broadly, in which we still have some operating in New South Wales and people with disabilities living in them. It wasn't until 1997 that legislation was passed ensuring that all children with disabilities in New South Wales could attend their regular school. It wasn't seen as an opportunity, it was seen as a right. Up until this point, mainstream education was a hard-fought option for a very limited few. The legislation ensured that students could attend the mainstream class of their local school, and with this came an intention of providing individualised funding to those in need so that schools could access resources that could facilitate full inclusion. In 2000, this funding came into effect. So if special schools was not built on evidence, what does the actual evidence tell us? Research into social and academic outcomes for students with disability has found no benefit from segregated education. A 2008 comprehensive analysis of the comparative research over the previous 4 decades concluded that no review could be found comparing segregation and inclusion that came out in favour of segregation in over 40 years of research. This 2016 comprehensive review of research covering over 250 studies in 25 countries that adopted the definition of the inclusive education in the general comment number 4 found that the academic and social outcomes for children with disabilities in fully inclusive settings are without exception better than in segregated or partially segregated environments such as special classrooms or support units. This 2016 comprehensive review covering, I'm having to navigate 2 slide sections at once, so excuse me. Finally, the impacts of segregation or inclusion in education have been found to apply during and beyond schooling years. A 218 comprehensive review by the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education, over 200 papers from a range of countries, including the UK, USA and Australia and continental Europe, into the relationship between inclusive education and social inclusion concluded that attending segregated settings minimises the opportunity for social inclusion, both in the short term while the child's at school and the long term after graduating secondary school. And attending a special setting is correlated with poor academic, vocational qualifications, employment in sheltered workshops, financial dependence, fewer opportunities to live independently, and poor networks after graduation. As you can see, there's a lot at stake there. So what is inclusive education? Fortunately, there is both an evidence base to tell us this, as well as a legal obligation to be fulfilled by 2030. Australia, as a ratified country to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, which includes Article 24 on education, has a general comment number 4 that has been provided to give clear practice instructions on implementing Article 24. The general comment not only talks about what inclusive education is, but it also discusses what it is not, importantly giving countries the guidance they need to reform their education system. When we talk about inclusive education, we talk about all students learning in the same general education classroom. We also talk about students being supported to learn with the same curriculum and with support to adapt the curriculum for each child. We talk about flexible structures and groupings of students regardless of ability. And importantly, we discuss what it feels like for a child to feel valued in the school community as a school community member and included in all aspects of school life alongside their same age peers. So sorry, just let me move my little slides. When considering what it is, it's also important to consider what it's not. Inclusive education cannot occur in segregated settings such as special schools or support units. It is not joining the general classroom and working separately in a corner with the teacher's aide. It's being included in the classroom in the work that the other students are doing. And it is not learning in a separate curriculum or being given a different program. And this is important to note because currently within our New South Wales system, we actually have no inclusive education guidance for school leaders and educators. Australia and New South Wales are clear on their obligation in relation to the UN Convention. We would be confident to say also that they're clear on the tremendous amount of evidence that supports inclusive education as being far the best option for this child with disability. However, there still remains a significant reluctance for transformational change to occur, leaving many young people with disabilities significantly disadvantaged and in many cases harming their life well beyond the school years. The moral imperative is important to note. Currently, we have many schools and staff and broader decision makers splitting hairs on whether they believe inclusion is the right way to go, sadly continuing to jeopardise a lot of young people's futures. To give you a bit of a snapshot, currently as it stands, I said at the beginning that we're a statewide organisation. We've actually got an increased rate every year of calls relating to education. So this is an issue that's not going away, and it's an issue that needs urgent addressing from the department's perspective. Some of the major issues or common issues that we get calls about are things like gatekeeping. We've got an example of a lovely pre-kindergarten student who happens to have a diagnosis, and their family had to approach 13 schools before they were actually allowed to attend a regular class. So even though we talked about the legislation being in place since 1997, in 2020, this is still a real issue for many families wanting to seek an ordinary educational pathway for their child who has a disability. Low expectations is another really common thing. I think one of the other presenters talked a little bit about that, and we all know it's very common knowledge that to be a good learner and to have high expectations from the part of the teacher is a critical part of that. Many families contact us because their child is either given very limited work that doesn't stretch their ability to learn, or in some cases actually no work at all. Partial enrolment is also another significant issue, and but this can go on for some students for many years without actually a reason from the school's perspective about why half days are only allowed or certain periods of the day or whatever it may be. And in many situations, fitting the need of the school environment instead of actually the need of the student. Micro-exclusion is another really significant issue, and that can occur. We talked about in a previous slide about a student feeling valued and a member of the school community. This happens very commonly in a lot of schools, not all schools. There's certainly some good schools out there where students are at every point excluded, whether it be from a school carnival, a school camp, a sporting day, a NAPLAN test, a theatre production, whatever it may be. Basically, in many ways, not even subtly, but out and out excluded from that event. And restrictive practice and suspension, they lie certainly in together a little bit with us, but this is a very significant issue, both from an accountability perspective, but also from the perspective of how our schools are currently catering to the needs and the support consideration of each child. So a lot of work to be done in this area. Okay, so just to talk about something outside of the systems, but we've actually, due to this parallel system that we've created with the special schools and where we inherently believe that people with disabilities belong, we've got a really significant issue in relation to attitudinal concerns. And the list above, or in the slides that you'll see there, is a very common list that families are told when either they want to actually enrol their child in a regular class, or they're already in a regular class, and the school decision makers or the teacher or the school counsellor, whoever it may be at the time, actually is trying to persuade them to go into a different pathway. And for those of you on the who are participants, who are parents out there, I'm sure you can absolutely relate how you could feel, how you would feel if any of those comments were made about your child. So family advocacy has worked closely with government over many, many years to try and certainly get to a more positive point with some of these issues. And however, this has had little or no impact, and families have strongly fed back to us that it's almost like creating, I can remember one family saying to me once, it's like creating somebody swimming through a swimming pool and you opening up as you're swimming through and it's closing up behind you. So that systems change, broader change just was not occurring. So we actually launched a campaign, a grassroots campaign, Same Classroom, Same Opportunities, and that's still going and very much driven by families. If you want more information about that, you can find that here. Okay, so this is bigger than certainly what we're doing and other interested people are doing. This is now a very strong national conversation. The Australian Coalition of Inclusive Education was formed not so long ago, actually, and it's basically a group of organisations that have come together across the country to actually look at progressing inclusive education, the transformation that's needed. We've also launched a roadmap to achieve this. What does that 10-year plan look like in relation to how do our education systems reform? So we're giving students, we're giving schools, we're giving teachers, we're giving the whole system what it needs to actually be successful for all students. There's a way to endorse this 10-year plan, and we've already gotten 20 organisations that have actually signed up for this. And I would suggest, if you're interested in actually being involved, look up Australian Coalition of Inclusive Education, and you can find basically a way to endorse this. Family Advocacy has also tried to develop its own strategies around it, how it helps people actually, number one, know their rights and how to advocate on this perspective, but it's also to help people think through the research and the practices and what's happening around the world in this space in relation to inclusive education. Okay, so we've got a lot of advocacy-related resources that are provided on our website as well to help parents navigate the system and to support teachers as well to be able to make this successful. Okay, these are our contact details, and I've been told that I'm pretty much out of time, and I would absolutely encourage anybody that wants to find out more about, I missed my slides over here, anything more about our presentation today, to please get in contact with Family Advocacy.
Thank you so much. So the first question is, what is the first step / priority in moving towards an inclusive education?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think certainly what we would say is an absolute first step is the government actually acknowledging that with any change management, you have to actually acknowledge where you're going. So to be able to say this is what we're working towards, and then to actually bring people along with them. I mean, there's countries around the world that have done this work already, so it's not that it can't be done. And one of the things that we would say to that too is that we also need an inclusive education policy to make that clear. So when we're talking about our school leaders, our educators, our families, whoever it may be, that there's clarity around what inclusive education is. So that would be an initial first step.
Wonderful. And then we have another question from Claire. Did you undertake any comparative analysis between inclusive provisions between public and private schools?
Would I be able to make any comparison between the two?
Did you take any comparative analysis between the two?
Yeah, look, certainly not closely. I know others have, but I know as far as the calls that we receive, it doesn't discriminate between public and private. And also what's in place within those systems either. This is this is felt across all education systems.
Do you feel that class size also might be affecting inclusion rates?
Look, I don't think so. No, I think this gets down to it gets down to many things. So I don't want to simplify this, but the fact that we've come from a system that segregates people, and we've got a system that's completely ill prepared to be able to accommodate students well. So in many cases, that's actually failing many students, and this is what students are feeling. This is what families are feeling. So when we're talking about the change that's needed, it's across the board, which is everything from upskilling, restructuring our systems, looking at things in a way that's going to accommodate all students, regardless of who they are, regardless of whether they've got a disability or not. So it's thinking through all of those things, and class sizes is just one element of that.
Would you suggest any physical components in the classroom or around?
Sorry, well, I'm finding it's a little bit bouncy with your volume. I'm finding it hard to hear questions properly.
Oh, sorry. So it says, would you suggest any physical components in the classroom or around the school to help with inclusive education?
Look, absolutely. We were fortunate enough to get some sponsorship to go over to New Brunswick a couple of years ago, and we took a group of family leaders over there to have a look at their system. They've been fully inclusive since the 80s, and one of the striking things around that was that the classrooms were very adaptable to any kind of need or whim, you know, and everything from sitting in a different type of chair, sitting on the floor, sitting on a beanbag, having headphones. It went on and on and on. So the intentionality around how they set up those classrooms was a lot more sophisticated than we would even consider here. And clearly that's because they're further along in that journey. And certainly that would then apply to the structures. And I'd say to you that there's countries out there that have been doing this very well, certainly a lot better than we have for many years. And there's a lot to be learned by who's gone before us on this journey.
Another question was there any work done with student suspensions for children and young people with significant disabilities, the length of suspensions, the effect of suspensions on children and young people, and the families, and how families, carers and service providers can work together to reduce these suspensions and the length of the suspensions?
Yeah, so is the question that you're asking if any work's being done on this?
Yes.
Yeah, and the answer would be yes. Certainly currently within the Department of Education, they're looking at certain policies that will be addressing that. However, we have reservations around the deep impact of that, because whenever you're looking at the student and you're looking at the student being at fault without looking at the actual environment and all the things that revolve around that environment and why that student is doing what they're doing, it's problematic as far as a solution. So there's a lot that we would be continuing to push that, as will other advocacy organisations, but it's not going to be wished away by a policy and some mandated training. It's going to need some significant reform.
Cecile, do you have any information on particular impacts on Aboriginal students? There's a question.
Yeah, so if an Aboriginal student happens to have a disability, then we would work at any information that we've got around that, and we're not an expert on that, but we would say that there's a double jeopardy as far as the impacts. So there can be double the impact. So certainly we also know that people from marginalised groups also can experience some very similar things, even if they don't have a disability, within the education system. And also that there's some data around people from marginalised groups, even if they haven't got a disability, actually ending up in things like support units or segregated pathways because of all sorts of issues that haven't quite worked out as far as their needs being addressed appropriately.
And we also have a question around what is the experience for these students during COVID-affected times? So what are the new challenges associated? Do you have any positive stories associated with these times?
Yeah, and look, it's hard for us to have a lot of positive stories because we're an advocacy organisation and people call us when things aren't going well. Certainly, I'll touch on the first part of that question. And actually, I do have a positive story, actually, but certainly what we've noted with COVID and people going to remote learning is we were getting a lot of calls and a lot of frustrations of students with disabilities that weren't actually catered for in that process and actually left out and assumed that they couldn't get on their Zoom meetings or whatever platform that they were using or couldn't participate. So we had a lot of isolated people calling saying that we're trying to get our child engaged in this learning experience and we just don't know how to do that because the school isn't being responsive. On the other hand to that, we've had contact with families that have worked really closely with the school and come on a journey as far as what inclusion is, so that what it is and what it isn't. And so done a lot of work in relation to that. And they found the response to COVID a lot better because the school had already done the thinking around how do they include somebody effectively? What does that look like? But certainly too, we've got families, their children will continue to be isolated well into this pandemic because of the vulnerability of their health and having to constantly navigate how they can still receive a decent education by being remote for what could be another 6 months quite easily.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Julie, for fielding the questions. I know it's not easy to do that on the fly, and thank you to all of the presenters today. I think there's been a lot of questions, and the importance of this topic is reflected by the interaction that's obviously happening on the chat. And I know that there will be a number of things that we'll be able to share with you, and we'll take it on board in terms of sharing our presentations. I'm just waiting for confirmation that the Minister has joined us. Not yet. Kate, is there any last things that you would like to say? Kate Bishop.
Thank you, Zoe. Yeah, yes. Just thank you to all for your participation today and for touching on what I think are really interesting reference points for the way forward. I think it's up to all of us from our different sectors to identify what we make of this and how we can work together to solve some of the complexity of the problems that all the speakers have identified from their different vantage points. And I hope we're all willing to join in collaboratively in that space. And to Julie, thank you very much for representing your own story, which is magnificent, and for carrying the day with the questions just now and joining us. I always think that a participatory approach with children and young people is the very best. The unique perspectives that we as adults, even with our best intentions, cannot have and cannot do without, no matter what our sector. So I'm very pleased that it's such a shared approach to the world between the two organisations hosting today's series. Zoe, thank you very much for joining with us in creating the momentum around these issues, and I hope we do good things with that post today and in all our other chats that we're going to host. And hopefully we can now move on to the Minister. But thank you all for participating for today.
Thank you, Kate. So you might have seen wonderful Rhys is still feeding me through some information, which is very helpful. I think we are still waiting for the Minister, but I think one of the things that when I took on this job in January, it was very clear that Rhys had an incredible passion about making sure that we did this piece of work and saw through this piece of work. And with young advocates like Julie around us, it makes it more possible for us. And as I said at the beginning, it might be challenging. It might be not something that we've done before, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. And what I would say for all of us who have obviously wanted to participate in this piece of work by being here today, but also in terms of the own learnings for our organisations, is that we should keep challenging and working together around how we can do this better. So one of the things that we want to acknowledge is the 370 children and young people who took time to speak to us about the things that were important to them. There were 24 organisations and educational institutions that were willing to help facilitate the 45 group consultations and prioritise the right of children and young people in their care to use their own voice and express their experience as a young person. And I had the great fortune of attending a handful of these with Rhys, and it was wonderful to see how willing children and young people were to share their views, and also how engaged the community was around these consultations as well. So we will obviously forward the material to you and when it is live in August. I understand that the Minister is having technical difficulties in terms of logging in, and that's okay. So we can see whether we can help him for the time being. It might be an opportunity if people want to stretch their legs, and we can come back in a couple of minutes when it is. I would encourage you to stay because obviously Minister Ward is incredibly passionate about this piece of work and it's obviously in his portfolio. But we will need to help him get online. So bear with us. If we had some slide we could put across, it's like that cinema where you could go and get an interval and get, but no one would remember that. So give us a couple of minutes and we will come back.
Hi, it's Teresa Norris and Megan Davin here. We were unable to connect
on my big laptop and we've been using my phone and we've got a very noisy background. We were just wondering, would you be able to email your slides to us at all?
I gave you a thumbs up, but then I remembered you were on the phone, so that's not very helpful. But yes, we can share slides with you.
Thank you very, very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
You're in.
Hello. Hello.
Minister Ward, how are you?
I don't know with my technology, but
that's okay. I think we're all learning in the new world that we're in. So I now have to give the formal introduction to you, Minister, if you can wait for 30 seconds as I do this wonderful piece.
Excellent.
And I always thoroughly enjoy introducing Minister Ward. We do great work with his office and he's a great advocate. So for those of you, Gareth Ward was born in Gerringong and has lived in the Illawarra and South Coast his entire life, and I'm sure he'll mention the Great South soon. Born with oculocutaneous albinism, sorry, apologies for that. Gareth has been legally blind since birth.
It's not a word in common parlance, so I'm not surprised. That's all right.
No, and I did actually practice it this morning, Minister. I apologise. Gareth is on the roll of admitted solicitors for the Supreme Court of New South Wales and the High Court of Australia, and I can also drop in here a little bit of information that he's currently studying as well because he's an excellent overachiever. In 2011, Gareth became the first Liberal member for the state seat of Kiama, and in 2019 was appointed the Minister for Family, Communities and Disability Services. Today, Minister Ward will give an overview of the New South Wales government role in disability services in the new world that is NDIS and some of the government reforms over the past 16 months. Thank you so much, Minister, for joining us this morning. It's good to see you.
Well, thank you very much. Wonderful to be with you. And can I also start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, wherever we are. We acknowledge elders past, present and emerging into the future. And I want to acknowledge the ongoing connection that Aboriginal people have with this and recognise all Aboriginal people as the original custodians of the lands on which we stand. And I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal people that are present with us today. I'd also like to thank the Office of the Advocate for Children and Young People for the invitation to talk on this important topic. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Parliament's actually sitting today, so if you do hear bells going off in the background, it's not the fire alarm, it's just probably a division bell. I may have to go depending on what's happening in the chamber, but I wanted to be able to spend some time with you today. And can I particularly thank Zoe for the great work that she continues to do as an absolute champion on behalf of children and young people. Since you've taken up this role, Zoe, at the start of the year, you've made some really good inroads, and it's been wonderful connecting with the groups that you've been meeting with and being able to provide some updates on what the government is doing. So, look, I'm going to provide a bit of an overview on a few things that may interest you, and then I'll have some time for questions at the end. The government continues to play an important role in disability services, as is in our best interest to ensure that people with disability receive the supports and services they need to participate in society and reach their full potential. I'm an example of that. I'm the first Minister for Disabilities to have a disability. The Commonwealth, through the National Disability Insurance Agency and the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, are mainly responsible for the NDIS. New South Wales still has a large role to play in this process. The government works closely with the Commonwealth, the disability sector, people with disabilities, their families and carers to ensure they are getting the support they need. At a very high level, the work we do includes participating in national reform discussions with other states and territories and their ministers and the Commonwealth in supporting our frontline staff in New South Wales to engage with the NDIS to ensure people receive the wraparound services that are holistic and integrated. So just because disability services aren't delivered by the state anymore, we're still a shareholder in the scheme, and I sit around the what's called the Disability Reform Council every 90 days with other ministers to discuss how the scheme is going from our state's perspective and to advocate for change. Our government is also aiming to increase the number of people with a disability employed in the public service. This is a key Premier's priority, to increase the number of people with disabilities in the public service to 5.6%. And the Public Service Commission is leading this important work with the support of all New South Wales government clusters. Now, I know you're also considering education and children with disabilities, so I'll talk a little bit about that too. Every child with a disability deserves the opportunity to reach their full potential in society and the opportunity to have access to education that meets their individual needs. In 2019, more than 23,990 students with confirmed disabilities were enrolled at 3,380 specialist support classes in mainstream and schools for specific purposes. This includes 970 classes in schools for specific purposes, which support more than 5,360 students. The overwhelming majority, though, of students, around 97% in fact, are in mainstream classes and schools, and around 80% of those students with a disability learn in mainstream classes within mainstream schools. The New South Wales Education's Disabilities Strategy is building a more inclusive education system, one where all students feel welcomed and are learning to their fullest capacity and potential. Teachers in New South Wales in mainstream schools and specialist settings are working with students with disability to achieve these incredibly important outcomes. However, raising demand as well as an increasing shortage of staff with specialist training means our system is facing unprecedented pressures. In 2018, 9% of New South Wales teachers were approved to teach special education. The New South Wales Education's Disabilities Strategy recognises that having a skilled workforce to meet demand is important into the future. And that's why the Department of Education is absolutely committed to developing these schools in teachers so they have the necessary skills and awareness to support all children and young people with a disability in the classroom, no matter their background, no matter their potential. COVID-19 has had a significant impact on the delivery of education, supports and training to all students. To support children with disability learning from home, the Department of Education implemented a number of actions, and I'll just go through them for you. They include a guide for teachers on additional learning and support needs for children with disability, a guide for itinerant support staff on support students learning from home, wellbeing for children who are learning from home as well. The Disability Inclusion Act and Disability Inclusion Action Plans are also an important part of what we do as a government. By no stretch have we actually said that because we're not in the business of delivering supports that we're in no way involved. In fact, we've stepped up our involvement with the creation of the Age and Disability Commissioner, Robert Fitzgerald, the first of its type in Australia, certainly with the powers that it has to ensure that we guard against abuse, neglect or exploitation. But the Disability Inclusion Act is also the cornerstone of the state's plans for disability inclusion. Every single government agencies, including the state's 128 local councils, are required to develop disability inclusion action plans and to report against their progress. These plans build inclusive practice into decision-making at a state and local level and contain important initiatives to make life more accessible and inclusive for people with disability, including in the education system. The Disability Inclusion Action Plans are developed through the consultation and ongoing engagement with people with disability. There are around 140 disability action plans being implemented across the state, and the Disability Inclusion Act is also currently under review. And in reviewing the Act, the Department of Communities and Justice conducted 9 public forums, 2 being Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander focus and 2 in regional New South Wales, which was there in Dubbo and Wagga. A number of online surveys were also received and many organisations put in submissions. I've just turned to the reforms that have been made through the Disability Reform Council in the past 16 months. I mentioned earlier that the Disability Reform Council is that council of all the ministers that I sit on, and we've actually really led the way when it's come to reform across the country by proposing a number of papers and also lobbying the federal government and putting forward proposals. And we seek to work collaboratively with other states and territories, and we try to work collaboratively with the Commonwealth when we can to implement national disability policies and reforms. The national response to COVID-19 and preparedness took priority over the last few months, which included significant measures to help protect and support people with disability. Since the rollout of the NDIS, work has progressed to improve the experience and interactions of NDIS participants with mainstream services such as health, mental health, child protection, justice, personal care in schools, and specialist school support. Other reforms we have pushed for include the ongoing development of a national disability strategy, resolving issues between the NDIS and mainstream mental health systems, improving the provision of transport supports, delivering and developing the market for specialist disability accommodation, funding of disability health-related supports under the NDIS, hospital discharge plans to promote timely discharge of NDIS participants from public hospitals, because often too many people are left in the hospital system rather than in home getting the SDA and CIL supports which are provided through the NDIS. Models of specialist school transport and personal care in schools, and the New South Wales Government will continue to work with our partners, whether that be other state jurisdictions or the Commonwealth and the National Disability Insurance Agency, to ensure that people with a disability and their families and carers achieve the best possible outcomes. It's been 2 years since we've had the NDIS now in New South Wales. We were the first state to sign up. I'm proud of the fact that it was our government in New South Wales that put politics to one side and said that we want to focus on good outcomes for people with disabilities. Tragically, too often politics gets in the way because people believe they have a point to make, and they believe that point is often more important than securing good outcomes. But I can report to you today that now more than 53,000 people in New South Wales are receiving supports that never got them under the old scheme. And that's because of the leadership of the Prime Minister of the day, Julia Gillard, and the Premier of the day, Barry O'Farrell, that struck that agreement. And it's certainly been one that isn't perfect. There's still a lot of work to do, hence the work program I outlined just then in relation to DRC. But we are achieving some wonderful things and we're breaking down some important barriers, and I'm very proud of that. I did touch briefly on the Age and Disability Commission. Robert Fitzgerald, who was our first Age and Disability Commissioner, is doing a sensational job. He celebrated his first year in the job from 1 July, and I know that that service is providing an important advocacy and support for people who feel that they have been treated poorly, particularly in the in-home care environment. And I'm very, very proud of having established that commission. It was my first bill as Minister into the Parliament, and I'm very, very pleased with the work that they're doing. Now, I'll shut up because I've been gabbering on for too long, and happy to take your questions.
Minister, there seems to be, I think there's one question that's come through here, which says young people with learning difficulties and cognitive difficulties are overrepresented in the youth justice system. What are some of the strategies in place to prevent young people with disability from entering the criminal justice system?
Well, we're trying to identify that criminogenic behaviour earlier. We have a number of programs across the Youth Justice Network that seek to intervene earlier, such as Youth on Track, and try and make sure that we address those behaviours earlier. In fact, I can report to you that we actually have some of the lowest numbers of young people in corrections or in youth justice that we've actually seen in a very long time. We've seen a 40% reduction over the last 10 years. We've got about 200 kids that are in corrections at the moment, or youth justice at the moment, I should say. Also, we've worked with the NDIS to implement what's called the Justice Liaison Officers, and they are about supporting people with cognitive impairments if they do engage with the justice system and try and obviously keep young people out of the youth justice system. Look, regardless of whether you have a disability or not, my view is that we should do everything we can to keep young people out of the youth justice system. I would say that I think that the piece of work we're doing at the moment is really important, because when I got this job, I asked for all the data I could get my hands on, and the department was already in the throes of producing a human services data set, which turned out to be the largest of its type of any government in the nation. And for those that are interested, Google forecasting future outcomes. Forecasting future outcomes. What that data set involved was 7.2 million data sets, 3.1 million young people over 27 years. And what it found is that just 7% of vulnerable kids and young people will comprise 50% of the welfare budget by the time they're 40. Now, one of the missing pieces from my point of view was school attendance data, because what I wanted was school suspension data. And because of representations I made to the Education Minister, there's now a digitized attendance system for schools across the state. And what I want to be able to do is access suspension data, so that when a child is suspended from school, we can ask, are they from social affordable housing? Are they students that have been in contact with the mental health system? Has there been an AVO issued at the home? Have they had a parent in jail? So that you can work out earlier the supports that are needed. Tragically, one of the groups that are overrepresented when it comes to suspensions is kids with disabilities. And that's why I've asked the Minister for Education to review the suspensions policy. I think we need to look more towards in-school suspensions. And if we can deliver outcomes there, I think that we'll see fewer children, particularly children with disabilities, in the youth justice system.
Thank you, Minister. And we might take one more. So we've got a question here that says, do you think that sometimes there is confusion about funding streams which influences on a holistic approach for the children and young people?
Yes, and look, we're trying to reduce that. There was a Auditor General's report out in relation to the success of what's called Their Futures Matter, which came on the heels of what was called the Tune Review back in 2015 into kids and out of home care. Now, that's recommended a number of important changes to the way we bring services together. Rightfully, people should expect, and this is what my view is, not just as a cabinet minister, but as just as a citizen of this state, I want to see people and governments working together. I don't want to see clusters. I want to see governments working across agencies to get outcomes. Things like the first 2,000 days of a child's life doesn't just involve my agency. It involves Department of Health, Department of Education and others, so that we make sure that those funding streams that you talk about aren't discombobulated, that we actually have strong connections and focuses on children and young people, not on this particular department or that particular program. What is it that we are doing to improve that child's life? What is it that we're doing to change that trajectory of that 7% that will comprise 50% of the welfare budget by the time they're 40? How do we intervene earlier? And how do we use government data to pick up those important signs?
Thank you so much, Minister, for your time. We appreciate it this morning. And one day someone will explain what all those bells mean, because it elevates me when I'm hearing a bell behind you, but you are very calm when that bell is happening behind you.
Oh, it's democracy in action here in New South Wales.
That's the exciting part. So thank you so much for your time, Minister, and thank you for the questions, everyone. I know that it's always incredible to hear directly from you, and I'm on a number of those groups around the work that you're doing, and I know that there is a real interest about putting children and young people centre of all of those things. So thank you for being a strong advocate around that.
Absolutely.
I do want to acknowledge, and it's going a little bit rogue and off script, but the Minister is here and we've just got this approval. So I do want to take an opportunity to actually announce the next chair of our Youth Advisory Group, which is Julie, who is sitting right here next to me. And so,
congratulations, Julie. Well done.
We are very excited that Julie will be leading us, and considering the wonderful advocate that she is in the work that she does, it feels very timely now that it's been approved that we can announce that for Julie.
Where are you from, Julie?
Dural.
Dural. Excellent.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah, not
Excellent.
South Coast, Minister.
No,
Sorry.
not South Coast.
Well, I'm sorry. can always move, but you know.
Yeah, I can move. Yeah.
No,
It
that's
is
great.
beautiful.
Congratulations, and look, know that any member of the Youth Advisory Committee that needs any help or assistance, feel free to come through to the Advocate's office or to my office. If there are things that you want to engage directly with me on, I'm always happy to hear from you. And just for those of you that aren't aware, I was on my Youth Advisory Committee of Shoalhaven City Council. In fact, I think I'm the longest serving member of that committee because I got elected to council at 22 and went onto that committee and chaired it. So I went from being a community member and advocating for a new youth centre in Nowra, which we got, right through to other causes and programs, and then actively got involved in local government as an independent initially, and then of course stood for Parliament at the age of 28. So I know how important youth action and advocacy is, and I really appreciate the fact that you're using your time to represent other young people to make sure their voices are heard, and know that I take your deliberations and decisions and views incredibly seriously. Feel free to follow me on Twitter or Facebook, and I do respond to private messages as best I can, and happy to hear from you anytime.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you so much, and it's an honour to take on this role.
Good luck.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you very much, Minister, and all the panellists for today. What a wonderful session, and we look forward to sharing our report with all of you. Thank you so much.